Hey guys, this is Jan for Chess24. Round 7 in Wijk aan Zee has been played. In round 6 we had number 1 in the world against number 2 in the world. It's hard to top that, but in round 7 we had quite an interesting game as well. We had the reigning world champions facing each other. Triple world champion Magnus Carlsen, the world champion in rapid play, blitz play and classical play, faced women's world champion Hou Yifan. Here we got the protagonist, Hou Yifan, with the black pieces against Magnus Carlsen with the white pieces. Of course, this is the scariest assignment you can draw in chess. It's not just Magnus Carlsen. Is Magnus Carlsen on a roll? He won 3 games in a row against Van Velde, Aronian and Caruana, and is no doubt going to intend to make it 4 in a row. Hou Yifan has not had a great tournament so far, has a respectable 2 out of 6, but her fans will be slightly disappointed. Had a great year 2014, the women's world champion. Got her rating all the way up to 2673, chasing Judith Polgar's records, or at the very least Judith Polgar's current rating. Let's have a look at the game. Magnus Carlsen starts with 1 e4. His main move, even though nowadays he's played a lot of 1 d4 as well. Hou Yifan is not a Berlin or Marshall or other boring super tournaments opening player. She plays c5 and plays quite some sidelines here, which I thought might be a problem in a field like Wijk aan Zee. She quite often plays the move g6 in this position, or she likes to play the Paulsen or the Taimanov, I believe we call it, with e6 and knight c6. Nothing in this game. She wants to play the move knight c6, which has been used by Magnus Carlsen himself to beat Fabiano Caruana the day before. However, in that game, white played bishop b5. Magnus Carlsen decides to deviate immediately, goes for the move d4, the main line, the open Sicilian. C takes d4, knight takes d4, and the first small surprise for me, I was expecting the move e6, posing back to the Taimanov. But Hou Yifan moves her pawn all the way to e5. This is the so-called Kalashnikov opening. First thing that you realize about the Kalashnikov, apart from the fact that this knight is attacked and has to move, is that it weakens the d5 square pretty much for good. But black is of course aware of that fact and hopes that by chasing this knight around a little bit, she will buy enough time that the permanent weakness of the d5 square is not the main factor in the position and that she can finish her development with a solid game. It's a line that has become quite respectable recently, at least to me. I wasn't that aware of it. It seems like it's leading to solid positions and a lot of very strong players are employing it. So not a bad line here and well worth having a look at. d6, kind of forced nowadays since knight d6 check is a threat. And Magnus Carlsen goes for the move c4. This is a move Carlsen has always liked playing, setting up this pawn center with pawns on e4 and c4. It is also the main line in this position. The alternative knight 1 c3 leads to slightly more concrete tactical play and could transpose into another opening, so-called Sveshnikov, if black goes a6, knight a3, b5, knight d5, knight f6, bishop to g5. We would all of a sudden have a theoretical position which is normally reached via a very different move order. However, Magnus Carlsen is not having any of it. He goes for the move c4, very much in his style, clamping down on the center. The main drawback, of course, that d4 becomes a permanent weakness in white's camp as well. Bishop to e7, very typical to develop this bishop ahead of the knight, intending to maybe exchange it with the move bishop to g5 before bringing the knight out, and we'll see this idea very shortly. Knight 1 c3, also note that Yifan waited with the move a6 until after knight 1 c3, because now this knight can't return to this square anymore. It has to go to the slightly less appealing a3. Next move might look a bit strange, but it has a very concrete purpose. The move bishop e6. Purpose is not so much to develop this bishop, but more to give this rook access to the d8 square, which turns out is very useful in black's strategic scheme, helps a little key tactic, which we'll see pretty much next move. Carlsen goes knight to c2. This is one of the two main moves here together with the move bishop e2. Knight wasn't really doing anything on a3, so it goes to c2, where at the very least it covers a d4 square and prepares to jump into action via e3 in the future. And here we see the point of black's play so far, the slightly surprising bishop e7 and bishop to e6. She plays the move I've been talking about all along. Let's jump into the game. Here we got Hou Yifan with Fabiana Caruana walking by in the background, weighing her options. And I believe it's not going to come as a huge surprise what she's going to play, since I've mentioned it around 8 times. Bishop to g5 is the strategic idea of the black setup, and it works tactically because it was prepared by bishop e6. If white tries to grab a pawn here with bishop takes g5, queen takes g5, queen takes d6, we see the point of it all. Now there is rook to d8, and those two pieces combine quite nicely to attack this d2 square and checkmate white. Queen c5, let's say, queen d2, checkmate. Nothing white wants, so of course he has to continue in a more restrained fashion, just keeps developing with bishop e2, bishop takes c1, rook takes c1. This position looked strangely familiar to me. Then I looked it up, and I had seen it recently in a game by Peter Svidler, who won a nice game with the white pieces here against Dmitry Andreikin. I believe one reason Peter won a nice game was Dmitry's next move here, queen g5, which looks a bit too optimistic, committing this queen to the king side, meaning it can't be used on the queen side anymore and can't really start an attack here by itself. So not a big surprise that Yifan decides to deviate from that game, plays the move knight to f6, much more natural, continues developing as well. Castles, castles, queen to d2, and it's time to take stock. Both sides have more or less completed their development. Black has a weakness on d6, but I believe black should be alright here actually, because strategically it did make a lot of sense to exchange the dark squared bishop, so the remaining pieces are all good pieces. Knight on c6, bishop on e6, knight on f6, and black only has one thing left to do, which is to get this queen out and find a way to defend d6 that is not too awkward, ideally with a rook to d8. Hence the next move, the move queen to b6. Now, if black has one more move, rook fd8, I believe she will be fine, and in the game after rook fd1, this is exactly what happens. Hou Yifan goes rook fd8. In my opinion, the position is quite equal, and she can be happy with the opening. The critical test from a theoretical perspective, at least, in my opinion, which was formed after a very brief look, is to grab the pawn on d6. Now, might look a bit strange because it's exchanging this weakness for the healthy pawn on b2, but it has certain advantages. Queen takes b2, queen to d3 back. All of a sudden, first of all, white is threatening to win the queen with rook to b1, but more importantly, he might develop some initiative. Now the knight jumps into d5 and is taken, and whatever pawn recaptures, more often than not the c pawn, will be a passed pawn, no longer stopped by its colleague on b6. So after a move like queen b6, for example, knight to d5, queen back to d8, this knight is quite powerful, and I believe white has good reasons to hope for a slight edge, some power play here. So theoreticians might want to look into the option of queen takes d6 in this position. I believe it could be quite important for the assessment of the whole line. Instead, Carlsen played rook fd1, not forcing the action yet, rook fd8, and we have, I believe, an equal position where both sides start maneuvering. Oh, I'm sorry, rook fd8, b3 is the move played, safeguarding the b2 pawn, which could, of course, not be taken yet because of rook to b1, but it still doesn't hurt to keep it safe and cover the c4 pawn at the same time. h6, always a good move to have. I'm not sure it was top priority, but certainly can't hurt either to create a luft for the king on h7. Carlsen follows suit with h3. Next move, once again, is a bit confusing, for me at least. The move queen to a7 I did not fully understand. I'm sure there's some deep idea behind it. I could not really get it. To my mind, the move rook ac8 looks very natural when I believe black has equalized. Typical move for white would be bishop to f3 just to cover this e4 pawn and preparing knight d5 followed by maybe c takes d5. That looks like black is fine. For example, queen to a5, hinting at b5, and after knight d5, just going for an ending with bishop takes d5, and the queens will be exchanged. I believe there's not all that much black has to be afraid of. So queen a7 was played in the game, and the position is so close that it can't be too bad, and the price of a single move is not all that high. Carlsen continues with a quiet bishop f3, and Yifan goes for, knight to e7. Now the move I'm not that sure about, because I would like this knight to be able to jump into d4 instantly whenever white tries to touch his knight on c2. So once again, I would have preferred to wait with rook ac8. My best guess is that Hou Yifan was not happy with this because of knight to d5 now. Bishop takes d5 and c takes d5. But I don't think that this position after knight e7 is all that serious for black. Maybe white is a little better after knight e3, but strategically black is in pretty decent shape here. Even if she has to go passive for a while, I think this should be quite acceptable. But it is something you could certainly argue about, and it would require deeper analysis. We found went knight e7 instead, preparing for a knight coming to d5. But that has a problem of losing control over d4. So of course Carlsen activates his other knight, goes knight to e3. Not a big deal, the knight just returns, now threatening knight d4, and the female world champion is asking her colleague, what do you want? Do you want to repeat moves, or what are you going to do against my knight coming to d4? Carlsen's answer is he just wants to continue the game. He plays the move bishop to g4. Very interesting strategic decision. He wants to get rid of his bishop on f3, which wasn't doing all that much. And in order to do so, he's willing to take on e6 and arguably improve black's pawn structure, because a pawn on e6 would cover these sensitive squares. However, it will also have its drawbacks, and we will see that in the game. I'm not sure bishop g4 was the best move. Knight f5 is a move that looked pretty tempting as well. Covers the d4 square, threatens the d6 pawn, maybe not immediately, but it has an eye on it. Has an eye on the king side, so it's a very strong knight. And if it gets chopped off, e takes f, knight to d4 looks normal. Queen to d3, covering both these guys. I believe white is better, because the light squares all of a sudden are very weak in black's camp. And should she ever go knight takes f3, queen takes f3, white has a serious edge because of his light square control and the weakness on d6. So knight f5 was a tempting option, but Carlsen played bishop g4 instead. Knight to d4, of course, bishop takes e6 and pawn takes e6. Bring us to the next phase of the game. These pawns on e6, d6 are always, and the pawn on e5, these three pawns are always an interesting kind of pawn center structure situation. It's very hard to determine if they're weak or strong. They cover a lot of central squares, which is good, but the pawns on e6 and d6 also can't be defended by a fellow pawn anymore, so they could very well be weak. And in the future, the black king could also turn out to be slightly weakened because he no longer has a pawn on f7 to guard him. So it is a mixed blessing. I believe in this situation, black is very solid. However, she also is a bit passive because she has to keep an eye on both these weaknesses. Knight c2, forcing the exchange of the knights, or at least forcing the knight out of d4. Knight takes c2 and rook takes c2. And we're gonna have this position for quite a while. Over the next couple moves, nothing really happens. Both sides improve their piece a little bit, so we'll go over them quite quickly. Rook d7, queen e2, rook a d8, rook d3, queen to c5, knight to a4, queen to c6. We see both sides have activated their forces a bit. Rook goes to e3 now, defending the e4 pawn, and in the future, of course, this rook has some ambitions of playing a more active part as well, but for now, it's consolidating White's position. Pawn to b6. This was necessary because c5 was in the air. It's not clear it was really a threat, but b6 to stop it for good doesn't really hurt. The knight goes to b2, embarking on a new journey towards d3, where it's also not doing all that much, has to be said. Rook f7, rook d2, knight to d7, maybe intending to put this knight on c5, knight to d3, and here is where we have to take stock and look at what White is up to. White wants to play knight b4, but it's not a very big threat that can't be parried by simple means. What Hou Yifan should have done, in my opinion, is to play the move queen to c7 back, so knight b4 no longer comes with tempo. Then after knight b4, just play knight c5, keeping the structure as it is, when Carlsen would have to try a new maneuver to provoke any weaknesses in the black camp. I believe this position is still very close to equality, and nothing bad would have happened. Instead, Yifan got a bit scared of the threat knight b4 and decided to stop it for good by playing a5, and I think a5 is a pretty serious positional mistake. Problem is that it fixes the black queenside pawns pretty much forever, and it weakens the light squares on the queenside. Both these squares, b5 and a4, will be very welcome landing places for the white knight, which immediately regroups. It goes to b2, and now it's planning to make its way to c3, and if it ends up on b5, we can already see it would attack this d6 pawn, which is a much bigger problem than the threat of knight b4. So I think a5 was a serious mistake and will create problems for the world champion, the female world champion, in the future in the game. Knight c5, knight d1, rook to f8. Looks nice and active at first sight. All the black pieces are operating. But the white pieces are also all well placed in the center, and I really like this next move, queen to e1. He's not touching his pawn to cover the f2 square, but he just goes queen e1 and keeps everything under control. This rook covers the f2 pawn, this rook covers the e4 pawn, everything is defended, and now the white knight can continue its trip towards b5. White is better, and we see the genius of Magnus Carlsen, how economically he's covered everything and freed his knight to do what he wants it to do. Hou Yifan realizes she has to go passive, goes rook d8, defending the d pawn, knight c3, rook to d7, queen to d1, queen is no longer needed on e1, knight to a6, and queen to h5. Another very typical method, now that Carlsen has forced black to go passively defend her d pawn, he's looking for new targets, new fronts to open, and he starts probing on the king side, goes queen h5, wants to go rook g3, rook g6, then bring the other rook and create an attack while black is busy defending her weaknesses. Very good positional play. Knight c7, another useful move, stopping knight b5 and covering e6 and the e8 square, but another passive move. We can see all the black pieces are a little stuck defending. Rook g3, king h8, rook to d3, and we see the white heavy pieces are already rolling into action. Rook e7, rook g6, very nice square for this rook, attacking e6. There's constant headaches about rook takes h6, rook takes g7. Excellent maneuvering by Magnus Carlsen. Queen to e8, good defensive move, pinning this rook. Rook to g3 and rook to d7. Hou Yifan does her best to hang in there and defend, even though it is, of course, not very pleasant. Here Carlsen goes for the move knight to d1. Very logical. The knight is supposed to deliver the final blow on the king side. Go to e3, go to g4, sacrifice itself on f6 or h6 and win. But Hou Yifan finds a great defense against this plan. It turns out it was not the best idea objectively. The strongest objectively would have been, now that black had to react on the king side, once again change directions, attack the queen side, go knight a4, more or less forcing the passive knight to a8. And in this position, it turns out black can't really move anything, and white will just slowly improve. h4, queen g4, maybe h5, and something is gonna drop. It's almost a Zugzwang position because all the black forces are supposed to maintain in their spots, but you have to play something. So this is a losing position for black. Carlsen missed that opportunity, or thought knight d1 was even stronger, but Hou Yifan shows her defensive skills, plays the move rook f7. The idea is after knight e3 to play rook to f6, and all of a sudden this pin is a bit unpleasant for white, because knight g4 no longer works. Black just takes on g6. So Carlsen had to retrace his steps, go back with the queen to e2. He's still better, of course, but his first wave of attack did not bring home the bacon. Queen e2, rook f4, stopping knight e3 for now once again. So Carlsen has to change directions, goes queen to e3, attacks the b6 pawn. And here, I believe Yifan commits another mistake, similar to the one a5 she committed earlier with the move a5 actually. She pushes the pawn, goes b5. Of course, this is tempting. The pawn was attacked and you want to get rid of at least one weakness. But b5 creates new weaknesses in the black camp. The pawn on a5 becomes very weak and black becomes very exposed to the breakthrough c5. So I think, even though it wouldn't have been pleasant, that the passive queen to b8 was to be preferred, and trying to hang in there, even though this is admittedly a very, very thankless task, especially against Magnus Carlsen, who of course enjoys playing such positions. But b5 gave some new targets, and Carlsen reacts immediately, plays knight to b2, preparing to recapture here with the knight, but also preparing to put this knight on d3, attacking the rook and supporting the c5 breakthrough, keeping an eye on the e5 pawn. Very strong little move once again, this knight b2 move. Rook d to f7. It's very hard to give good advice here because the position is just bad. And Carlsen plays very strong and very concretely. A natural move would have been knight d3, which would also have been a good move. Carlsen doesn't even want to allow b takes c. Now any move, king h7 let's say, knight takes f4 is not yet possible, even though white is much better here as well after c5. Instead he wants to optimize the impact of the coming knight d3 and play c5 first, breaking up the black pawn structure. If d takes c5, now knight d3 is a serious blow, not so much threatening knight takes f4, but more knight takes e5, and the black position just collapses. So Yifan went queen c6, the most resilient there is, knight to d3. This looks like a blunder at the very first sight because the pawn on e4 is hanging, but Carlsen had seen that and probably hoped for this because rook takes e4 runs into rook takes h6. And if you take this off, it's checkmate. Queen h6, rook h7, queen f8, and checkmate. Typical sign of good technique to calculate these small variations. So knight d3 poses some very awkward problems. And Hou Yifan, to her credit, does not collapse here, as I believe a lot of players would have, but she finds some amazing defensive moves. Rook h4. Oh no, I'm sorry, not rook h4 yet, but she realizes that knight takes f4 is not yet a threat. So she goes b4, strong move, planning to activate this knight, if possible at all. Queen to e2, this is a fantastic move by Magnus Carlsen. It's hard to explain even, but he just wants to create new threats, and now that black had to react on the queen side, he's once again ready to switch his queen to the king side and go queen h5, threatening rook h6, probably overstretching black's defenses once and for all. Extremely strong move, and also queen e2 of course prepares to capture on f4, which was not yet possible because of e takes f4 with the 4. b4. Queen e2, excellent move. The tactical point being, after rook takes e4, queen h5, that there is just no defense to the many threats. But here is where Hou Yifan starts defending amazingly. Rook h4, only move stopping queen h5, and once again hoping to get in knight b5. Carlsen played the very human move rook to g4, Our beloved friends, the computer is giving the move queen to d1 here, which is a move I don't think many humans would consider at all. Apparently, it's very strong. And online, a lot of voices were heard that queen d1 is obvious. How can Carlsen miss such a move? Those voices did not really explain what the move is about, and I also struggle to do it. It just seems that black is in some sort of Zugzwang and there's nothing good she can do. For example, knight b5 now runs into the very sneaky knight takes e5, d takes e, queen d8 check, picking up the h4. So queen d1 would have been a pretty cool move, but even Magnus Carlsen is human, probably did not consider this at all. Went for rook 6 g4, a natural move. Rook takes, queen takes. White is still much better, but Hou Yifan has managed to hang in there admirably. King to g8, defending the rook on f7 before it gets attacked. Queen to h5, this would have been the time it gets attacked. Queen takes h6 is another threat, however, so it's still pretty unpleasant. Hou Yifan decides she has to activate at least one piece, goes for the best move, knight to b5. Posing maximum problems here. Now Carlsen plays rook g4. There were some more direct ways to play here. C takes d6 is endorsed by our friend the computer. After knight takes d6, matters aren't all that easy. Queen takes h6. Knight takes e4. Queen to g6 is one of these weird computer lines, knight g3, and the cute tactic, queen f7, king f7, knight takes e5, with a knight ending. But first of all, you have to calculate all this correctly. Then you have to be sure this is winning, which I, for example, would not be. I have no idea what's happening here. White has good winning chances. Black might have drawing chances. No clue. Still, this is not what Carlsen chose. He went for the more controlled move, rook g4, which is more in his style. He doesn't want a direct infight yet. He just wants to keep probing and overstretching the black defenses. But after knight c3, it's not simple. Hou Yifan has done extremely well to stay in the game, and I tweeted that very thing after queen h6, praising her defensive skills here. But this is the very position the second I tweeted it where she went astray. Not a surprise, because of the heavy pressure she's been under for a long time. And she goes for the natural move, knight takes e4. However, this turns out to be the losing mistake. What she had to find is the pretty cool tactic queen takes e4, using her queen as a decoy. After rook takes e4, g takes h6, queens are exchanged. White is slightly better in the ending after rook g4 check. This is forced because the rook was hanging. King h7, c takes d6, rook to d7. But black would have pretty good drawing chances because of the very active knight. So there was the last chance to stay in the game and prolong her very impressive defense. But she did go knight takes e4, the more natural move, which has some problems. Carlsen played queen takes e6, and I believe Hou Yifan's intention must have been to play the move knight takes c5 here, which looks completely natural. What I can imagine she missed here is that in this position white has a tactic to go knight takes e5, leaves his queen en prise under attack of the black knight, but in turn attacks the black queen and exchanges queens, reaching a very good ending for white. Knight takes e6, knight takes c6. This knight will capture the pawn on a5, then the pawn on b4 will be weak as well. This position is probably winning for white. So instead, after queen takes e6, Hou Yifan decided to try something desperate. Let's switch to that scene. This is still the scene from the opening. Here we are. Make some moves. Let's see if it works. Here we got the players both thinking. Note that Hou Yifan put on a jacket since the opening phase. It seems like it is pretty cold in the playing hall in Wijk. And she goes knight takes f2. Magnus Carlsen looks confused for a moment and is trying to calculate the lines, which I believe he will do. He's going to make a move in a while, so we'll stick around till that. Because knight takes f2 looks nice, and if white were to go knight takes f2 here, capture the knight, then after queen takes c5, black would be okay. She would win back the piece on f2 and would be in the game. But instead there is knight takes e5, and this is a hammer blow which effectively ends the game. Let's have a look. Knight takes f2. Here, as mentioned, if knight takes f2, queen c5, and this pin keeps black in the game, winning back the piece, even though she would be worse even here. But instead, knight takes e5 just ends the game. The same tactic we have seen earlier, d takes e doesn't work because the queen is under attack. Queen takes c5 doesn't work because it's checkmate after queen takes f7, checkmate next move. Hou Yifan tried one last desperate trick, knight takes h3 check, hoping for g takes h3, which would turn the game around after queen takes c5, check. Black is so active that black is better here because of the exposed white king, queen f2 or queen c2 coming, is knight hanging. But that remains a dream, and after knight takes h3, Carlsen just went for king to h2. There is no more checks, and literally every black piece is attacked. The knight on h3 is attacked, the rook on f7 is attacked, and the queen on c6 is under attack. Black will lose a lot of material, and therefore Hou Yifan decided to resign here. Very interesting game, great defensive effort by Hou Yifan, but in the end it was not enough against Magnus Carlsen in great shape, who played a lot of little moves, which are always hard to praise in a video like that, but he is of course tremendously strong in such maneuvering positions. As for mistakes or explanations, the only ones I can think of really, I believe this move a5. Hou Yifan did not do herself any favors, it just created too many weaknesses, and those were expertly exploited by Magnus Carlsen, even though the female world champion defended very well. So that means Magnus Carlsen wins 4 games in a row, something he has not done since, I'm not sure, 2009, and he takes over the lead in the Tata Steel Masters 2015. Tournament ain't over, there's still 5 games to go, so it stays exciting. A lot of world-class players still in proximity. We'll see what happens. I'll see you watching the tournament on Chess24 or during my next recap videos. Thanks for watching this one, and see you guys around. Bye bye.